Hello, my name is Les Back and welcome to this bonus edition of Recovering Community, the podcast about community, what it means, how it's formed and how it can be rebuilt. Today we meet world-renowned sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, distinguished University Professor Emeritus in Sociology, University of Maryland, College Park, and the Charles Phelps Taft Professor Emerita of African American Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Professor Collins visited Glasgow on the 14th of October 2024 to give our inaugural Racial Justice Lecture. This was the first event in a new series of public lectures which has been established through the university's Understanding Racism, Transforming University Cultures programme. This initiative aims to address structural racial inequalities faced by our community and publicly states our commitment to being an anti-racist institution. It was an extraordinary occasion, introduced by the principal, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, along with my friend and scholar activist, Professor Satnam Verdi. Some of the titles of Professor Collins' books include Black Feminist Thought, Fighting Words, Black Sexual Politics, From Black Power to Hip Hop, and most recently, Lethal Intersections, Race, Gender and Violence. She generously offered to record this interview before her lecture. I've followed Patricia's work for many years, and her insights on understanding community play an important role in my teaching. We talked about her work, and in particular her writing on what she calls the new politics of community, which is an issue very much at the heart of what we're discussing in this podcast. We started, though, talking about her reflections on visiting Scotland.
I have really not had much of an opportunity to travel to Scotland. So Scotland to me is somewhat still unknown. I've been to the UK many times, but that's a different entry point to this. So what's been interesting on this trip for me is access to ideas about Black people in Scotland and Scotland's role in the slave trade, but Scotland's role as basically the architects and engineers and the wealth of Scotland and how that was connected to the transatlantic slave trade. So that is new for me. But this particular trip, I've got two different views or two different places where I've landed in relationship to Scotland. The first, St. Andrews, which was quite a wonderful place to be, but in many ways was quite insulated, beautiful, small, intimate, and I wouldn't say secluded, well, I'd say secluded up to a point, peaceful. You could really feel that the world was far away in this beautiful place with such wonderful people that I met there. Glasgow has a bit more energy to it, in fact, considerably more energy. Yesterday, I was walking around and it was not beautiful. It was windy and I was cold. I had to buy a hat, but I went on the Black History tour of Glasgow and was able to hear about this history in ways that surprised me. Some didn't, but some really did surprise me. The whole compensation of enslavers for the loss of their property and have that called reparations. That's where I had to raise my hand during the tour and say, what? Reparations? Say more about that, because the word compensation and reparations were kind of used interchangeably. And of course, the tour itself is looking at built space and how money is hiding in plain sight. But it was really the site of the financial district. And that was fascinating to me in terms of just standing there, because often what happens with Black history and African history is the significance of capitalism just doesn't show up as a theme. So I was really appreciative of this particular tour in pointing out these kinds of things as we stopped. So I feel I've been on a steep learning curve, to answer your question, since I arrived. I have had the opportunity to meet with a local group, a community group of Black women, women of color, and that was a really interesting meeting in the McCune building. So I love these kind of contrasts between the building and then the history of what the building is trying to invoke. So that was one thing. And then yesterday's tour was great. I had lunch with the McCune scholars. So that was really lovely. It really gave me a sense of how much good is going on. These were students who were energized. I travel a lot, and when I meet with Black students, there's a range of how they talk to me. Very often, I'm hearing horror stories. Now, these were newer students, so I don't know if they're going to have their own horror stories or not. But I think at this point, they were enthusiastic. They were really focused on the work that they were going to do. It was so different from each other. And I enjoyed that because that's how I position my work. It's very much interdisciplinary. I've struggled a fair amount over the last 20 years to make it more global, to try and overcome my handicap of being American. Now, notice how I say handicap. But I'm trying to overcome the limitations of being educated in the United States and the blind spots that creates and the bad behavior that creates abroad.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, Patricia? Because in some ways, the lives of people like James McEwen Smith are a clue about those connections and the interconnected stories that we share in some important senses. I know what you mean about being around the McEwen scholars. It's such I think, appropriate way to honour his legacy and the legacy of those who are fighting back against the oppressions of that time and ours. And there's something about their curiosity and the range, from PhDs about soil to, cross-cultural discussions of autism. And you think that's just such an extraordinary manifestation of the potential of scholarship.
Definitely. At the same time, we cannot put the burden or the responsibility for all the change on a statistically small group of people, because this is statistically quite small, even though these are big personalities and big potential. What's nice about yesterday was I really feel, in fact, both events since I've been here, I really feel that we were constructing a sense of community, not a sense of group, not a sense of collectivity, not a sense of none of that other stuff, but something that's a space that is claimed, developed, owned, and changed by people who benefit from that space in some way. I was asking them about that in terms of how do you construct a community while you're here that isn't one just of helping the university do better, which is certainly one important mission. But in some places that can become the only mission, where students like these beautiful McEwen students are basically, let's get your photograph for cosmetic diversity purposes. So it's very important to guard against that kind of use of their image, their ideas, et cetera, and not to continue to look to, well, what about the institutional commitment? For example, someone mentioned to me or queried the whole notion of how, not worried this person was, but the question that the program is funded for 5 years. This means that one has to continually go out every 5 years and find that money. Now, if we're really talking about how many years would this be in terms of slavery and compensation and all that? Hundreds of years. So every 5 years you have to show up with your hat in hand for that particular, to fund something that is going well, is successful. We can do better.
Well, I think,
we can do better.
We all have to put our money where our mouth is.
I think that would be a good way of putting it, yes.
And I think institutions, but also across the piece. I think that's a very powerful reminder that you give us, actually, in so many ways.
We all have to do this because in some ways we're benefiting from the changes that occur. And it's not just McEwen, it's sort of when you diversify an institution, you get more ideas and better ideas at the table to improve that institution. You get more excellence if you look at it that way, as opposed to it's our civic duty to let in the lesser folk. Or at the same time, the white Scottish students who are probably quite wonderful as well, but who could easily develop resentment of students who are receiving this degree of support, or the students who are Black students or students of African descent who are equally good but are not receiving one of the McEwen scholars. So you're really setting up within Black communities a bit of tension and pressure that need not be there in terms of why are you the chosen one and I'm not. So there's a lot that has to be thought through. It's a complicated thing when we recruit and celebrate one group of people who are entirely worthy of that. But it also raises broader questions about social justice issues, even beyond issues of race, about everyone else. I was raised working class. I see class in ways that people do not necessarily see in institutions of privilege. So I am looking not just for sort of black and working class, but a white and working class as well. So anyhow,
It's very true of Glasgow's history. It's a working class city.
this is what I'm interested
river.
in coming to the UK. I started coming to the UK because the discourse on race in the US was about race and not class. Race was a stand-in for class. So we're used to thinking about class through racialized language. Whereas I got to the UK and people were quite comfortable talking about class in ways that struck me as being quite honest. I like that about Scotland.
Patricia, you wrote this really beautiful essay in 2010, The New Politics of Community, and you mentioned community in passing already, and I just wanted to ask you, it was an important moment for you, it felt like, another big lecture that you gave, why you chose that topic and why community is such an enduring topic in sociology.
I think community is a word of power. And I'm always interested in words of power and how they're deployed, how power is taken out of them. A term like freedom or even empowerment, those terms really came out of social movement settings very much, but then become reconfigured to mean something else. You can be free to be anybody you want, unencumbered by anything else if you buy my toothpaste. Is really what's happened to terms of freedom in a lot of ways. So I was interested in words that do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of social phenomena, but aren't necessarily seen as such. Now, I came through the movement. I came through the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, and the language of community was central to organizing. But it meant something quite specific than when I got to sociology and I was reading sociological theory and discovered community was this apolitical, ahistorical, primordial space of love or people just like you. That's what made it a community. And any diversity within that community was hierarchical, and it might be lifelong and forever. So the trade-off for belonging and the trade-off for love was basically a hierarchy. There didn't seem to be any space in that language for the kinds of social changes around me. Skip to another spot, Benedict Anderson's work on imagined community, totally the opposite end. You see, this first end was constructing community as primordial and also pre-modern. That was another thing. People who cling too much to the past, who cannot change. There was a whole discourse in there from modernity that I just was not happy with. Now, here comes Benedict Anderson talking about imagined communities. What is it like to construct a community or be in a community where most people will never meet face to face? And that says a lot to me about the kind of what was coming. But he wrote that book, I believe, in 1983, prior to the internet, prior to cyberspace, prior to the communications devices that allow people who will never meet each other face to face to do so, only virtually. So it's almost like now I look back and I'm thinking, I didn't know all of this when I wrote this article or when I decided that was going to be my program theme, the new politics of community. I knew we were in the new politics of community, but I couldn't quite figure out exactly what it was. I think now I have a much more complex argument, but at the time I wanted to lay down the gauntlet. The other thing that was happening at that point in time was Barack Obama was nominated for president. He was running for president, but it just turned everything upside down. In terms of America, the possibilities of having a black president in America, and he was incorporating quite a bit about community service, as in service to the country, in his platform. So he was really, I think, pointing to all the people that kept America going, whether it was military service or everyday service or community service. The whole notion of if you belong to a community and you benefit from belonging, you have to make contributions to it. He was raising those types of questions in his campaign. For me, it was just I picked the theme. I thought, let's hope he wins. We had to be prepared either way. That was also the global financial crisis, which takes us back to all these questions of class and community in ways. So, in pulling together my presidential address, and I'd like to point out there were 5,000 people at that meeting, not necessarily at my address, but that was a lot of people. I just thought, I want to say something that speaks to the entire sociological community, which is quite diverse. People tend to think of sociologists as being cut from the same cloth. I refer to it as like herding cats. That's what sociologists are like for me. Right? So I had a vision of all these meowing sociologists, wanting to go in different directions with this same word. Not realizing this was a word that was joining the profession together, the sociological community, my departmental community, my university community, my where I live community geographically, my identity community. It really does a lot of heavy lifting. So that's what I wanted to do. Now, how effectively I was doing that at that time is another question. I fortunately have had an opportunity to return to my own article and do a retrospective 20 years later. There's a follow-up piece in a psychology journal. But that particular piece, really looking at sites of where community mattered, very different from one another, was designed to get at an argument about physical place as community. It's where a lot of people think about it. Ethnic group is another place. Family as community, community as family. At that point in time, feminist research had done quite a bit in unpacking the naturalized hierarchy of family. And community was the next circle out, like extended family community. So I was going down a variety of roads. The cyberspace, virtual communities was very new. And it's hard for me to believe I'm saying this 14 years later, but so much has happened with that.
It's so true. And, you signal that. I think it's interesting that Anderson himself was talking about the importance of mediation and media, but the moment that you're writing about it, that sense that common connections can happen both that connect people at a distance, and that combination between proximity and distance is something that introduces a whole series of other challenges.
Well, it also brings us to this current moment where it feels like the globe has shrunk. Most people in the globe are never going to meet each other face to face. So we have to imagine ourselves as part of this global community if we want to look at it that way. But in terms of living on the globe and sharing space and not destroying the earth, definitely we have to. So I thought I was onto something, but it's only recently that I've come back to it. I just,
Clearly you were,
you have to let things sit.
It's what you were saying before about anticipating that which is coming. Do you see your work in those terms?
With hindsight, I definitely do. When I was doing it, not necessarily as much. If I were to look at Black Feminist Thought, which was published in 1990. Yes, I've been out here a while doing this. But 1990, first of all, I had no clue I was writing to a much broader audience than African-American women and men and an academic audience. I wanted to get to the public, the American public, but I wasn't thinking anything more broadly than that. And as the work began to travel, and I got an email from a group of women in Poland who wrote to me and said, "We thank you very much, Dr. Collins, for your book." I'm thinking, where? Poland? How did that happen? That kind of thing. I realized that the ideas traveled, but the whole thing of not anticipating how far they would go. When I have people come up to me now and say, "I've read Black Feminist Thought, and a lot of what you're saying in there is just speaking to me and changing my life." These are people who were not even born when I was writing. So I take this quite seriously to think, just do your best with what you have at a given point in time. I had no idea that was going to happen. It was all speculative that the book would even get published. That's where things were at that point. So, yeah, lots of...
One of the first pieces that I had such a strong impression on me was your piece that was, I think it's called Outsider Within.
Learning from the outsider within. The sociological significance of Black feminist thought. That was 1984 or 6, somewhere in there.
It was such an important insight into and challenge to say, well, proximity doesn't necessarily mean any sense of shared common space.
Nope.
I mean, you may be in the same and the way that you make that argument in terms of the racialization of those spaces and relations, as well as the gendering of them.
You see, the question would be, when anyone assumed that slavery was integration, you would not mistake a slave experience for racial integration or gender integration. You would assume that there are power dynamics there. And yet the language obscures our ability to see that. So what I was doing was not necessarily, I didn't even criticize sociology. I wanted to belong to sociology because I respect it, first of all, but I wanted to access the tools of sociology for my own work. But I realized that the parameters around the field were such that I would have to create my own space in the field. So I had to create a language that said that what I want to work on, the sociological significance of Black feminist thought, is to say Black feminist thought is significant. Mm-hmm. Black women's ideas are significant. This oppositional knowledge is significant. I'm going to talk about oppositional knowledge of young people tonight. I'm not going to use these terms, but this is what I'm going to do tonight. I just needed to create this space where I could grow and say, just leave me alone, because I'm really not going to pay attention to your standards the way you think I'm going to. And I thought to myself, and if this doesn't give me the space, intellectual space I need, I will find it somewhere else. There are a lot of young, talented people who are doing that right now. They're not going into the academy. They're not going into doctoral programs. Mm-hmm. They're going into film studies programs. They're going into programs where they can do intellectual work without the degree of intensive gatekeeping that academia has done. Mm-hmm. So that piece was early on, and I should tell you the backstory, it almost didn't get published. Because when I sent it to Social Problems, that's the first piece I ever submitted to a journal ever in my life. Okay, it's my very first article. That's why it's so clear. But here's why it was really so clear. I submitted it to Social Problems, one of the top journals in sociology. The editor wrote me back and he said, well, I've sent this to 4 reviewers. Now that's unusual. Usually it would be 3. Now you can be 2 if you're lucky. He had sent it to 4 and he said, well, they really are the range and I want you to read all of them. One is really favorable, one is really negative, and there are 2 in the middle. So if you choose to resubmit, I will return it to the 2 in the middle. Now, that's the preface. I start reading the reviews. One of the reviews was, I kid you not, 3 pages of single-spaced. It was almost like reading hate mail. I cannot believe this kind of garbage is being produced. This is what's wrong with the field. I really cannot believe this is really ridiculous, blah, 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 and went on and on and on and on. Someone who really had I thought might have had, stroke over reading this particular article. I thought to myself, oh, this is not good. I don't know if I like this sociology stuff. One was so celebratory. I thought, well, that's nice. But and the 2 in the middle made suggested changes. They said, we understand your project. You might be able to do it better if you thought about this. Fortunately, I was going to the American Sociological Association meeting just after I got all that, literally the same week I got that back. And I'm standing in line, and it was my opportunity to test people about, what's your response if you got reviews like this? And they said, oh, you stepped on some toes, but that's not the issue, is that person, it's not you. Yeah. And I needed to hear that. So I fixed my little article and I sent it back in, and that becomes the one you ask me about 30-something years later, 40 years later.
I use it in teaching all the time. I've taught it over and over again, and students have learned from it over and over again. But I wonder that as you're talking, Patricia, and tell me if you think this is right, there is a kind of link between the argument you make there about the complex configurations of inequality and injustice, and also the complexities of community itself that can sometimes mask those things. Because I just looked up before we started this phrase from Raymond Williams, where he talks about community being a warmly persuasive word that kind of glosses so many things. And I wondered, if why there's something about the link between attention to the intersections of inequality at the same time the work that language does politically.
I actually think that's spot on. That is exactly what I have in mind. It's a warmly persuasive word. And the thing is, the term I use is malleable. It really travels well to all different kinds of places without having to dress it up too much. Because if you start listening to how people are using the word, they are either using it antagonistically. That's the ugly community out there, the far right community, they who've done these things. But if they look at their own communities, warmly persuasive is interesting, because within one's own community, this is the place you belong, and it tends to be a place that erases social inequalities. So it's like, no, you have to construct a community. The notion of it's not a primordial thing you're born into, it's like pre-existing. That's not it at all. We're always constructing communities across differences of power. And then managing that, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes you have to join arms together and say the external forces are so great, we will all die unless we do band together. Slavery was pretty much like that. Or situations that are extreme are pretty much like that. And those are communities of necessity. Those are communities of solidarity, where at groupthink, you have to present the notion of groupthink because there's no space in the community for individuality. The threat is so great from outside. But on the other hand, maybe it's not as great as we think it is these days. So raising questions of inequality from within the boundaries of community can get you excluded, excommunicated, run out, etc. Because you can run into some really strong groupthink that is not critical. And that, I think, is another way of coming at this. Church communities, evangelical communities, people who fear if they leave the comfort of their community where they belong and we all agree, etc., what will happen to them? There's a lot of emotion tied to community. So, I don't know if I dismiss it as warmly, almost like emotions are not important. They are fundamentally important. And that's I've made quite a bit of progress in terms of my own thinking about this, because the pieces of this argument are just scattered all over the place. 10 years ago, we were not talking about the sociology of emotions. All right, that was Eduardo Bonilla Silva's meeting. And I thought, Eduardo, you're a race guy. Why are you doing emotions? Same thing. Patricia, you should be doing intersectionality. Well, that was fine. It was going to be fine on its own. It didn't need me to promote that. That's why I wanted to do something different with community that would challenge myself.
So interesting. I just reread the essay before coming to meet you today, and telling that you kind of end with the question of emotion and care. Can I just read you this little passage? It's such a beautiful passage, not to quote you back to yourself, but just to...
But I honestly forget what I've written. I have to look myself up sometimes.
But just to ask you how you think about where you ended now and the kind of things you may supplement. I suppose that's the spirit I wanted to... But this is a very beautiful passage. So people do not aspire for a better or different world for intellectual reasons only. They act because they care. People who care about their communities and the projects that harness emotions for political ends possess a staying power.
That's right, depending on which side of power you are on. Unfortunately, this is why racism is so durable, because all of that can be annexed to a political agenda that says you must belong to my community or the world will explode. But on the other side, it cannot be. There has to be an equally deep commitment to the community of building an inclusive world, a democratic society, democratic participation. You cannot be committed to a community that has internal hierarchy. It's just wrong. It's ethically wrong to do that. So yeah, the caring is crucial. My understanding of the reading that I've done on fascism, it's the harnessing of care to the agenda. I am the father. I am the one that has the answers. Follow me, and I'm going to scare you if you leave, kind of thing. So I guess I've been doing a fair amount of reading on this. I've been reading about cults lately. I've been very interested in how people who leave cults, because that's usually who are writing the books that I like. Mm-hmm. That's where you kind of get a sense of so much of it is emotion. It's not intellectual at all. It's basically, I have all the answers and I will care for you. And a way of organizing a community around those particular norms and values that can be very effective and function quite well, but that in many ways erases individuality and independent thinking in ways that I find quite scary. So as long as we're all like sociologists and we refuse to be herded like cats, I'm a lot happier with that particular point of view.
I wanted to ask you about this, and maybe it's a good time to ask it now. Your journey of learning and thinking so carefully about these questions, what kinds of community would you want to argue for? What qualities would they have?
One thing that they would have is some kind of ethical core. Ethics would be at the core of the community. And it would have to be an idea that's big enough and robust enough such that people could commit to the community, but that it's not as if there's any one way of expressing that. It's like an unfinished project. It's actually, democracy is a really good idea for forming a community. We're all better together than separated. We can get more things done together. But when I think about, models that I think are just really, really good, it's people who are all pulling in the same direction, but who have perhaps arrived on different paths to get there. It's very much like intersectionality. The book that I just finished, which was a hard book to write, is very much about people forming communities of all sorts to solve a problem. Often people will come together to solve a problem. We have global warming, it is a problem. But they get there and they have to figure out, how do we organize ourselves to do that beyond just the task at hand? Are we in this for the long haul? And why are we in this for the long haul? I'm a believer in social change. I want communities to be stable places where one can work for social change. You can't work for social change if everything is changing. You have no base. So I don't know, it's an interesting question. I'm going to think about my answer and probably argue with myself tomorrow a little bit, because that's usually how I work. I kind of like, let's try this, and then next day I'll be arguing about it with myself. But I think increasingly what I would say is I do seem to be trending toward ethics as a core of everything we should be doing. And I'm not particularly interested in working with people who are just transactional. But I think there's something bigger than that, especially when you're looking at questions of children, or you're looking at dependent human beings, or you're looking at what kind of world you want to live in. Mm-hmm. I do not want to live in a purely transactional world. I want to live in a world where communities are continually forming around things for the better, for the public good. From this trip, what I'm coming away with is I'm probably going to stay with this work. Mm-hmm. All right, because I returned to it and I said, why would I do that now? Well, I know why. The catalyst of the election.
Yeah,
allows me to think about all this.
I don't want to.
No, we're not going down that road. But I think the thing is, about 2 weeks ago, I discovered I've claimed a new identity, and it's the identity of I now see myself as a thought leader. So I see my job as really thinking about the broader issues that inform how we think about things, whether we win or whether we lose. I prefer to win, but I don't win all the time. In fact, I've won remarkably little in my lifetime, the kinds of things I have been standing for. So it's really nice to arrive at this moment where I'm not guessing all the time. I know stuff.
You certainly do. Thank you so much. We're blessed to have you here, and we've learned so much, those who've read your work over many years, and how you've led our thinking.
Thank you.
But can I ask you the other question, which I wanted to ask, but because you kind of built to the crescendo so brilliantly. Our podcast is called Recovering Community, mm-hmm. and in many respects, we've sort of been using the title of our podcast to think with, in the sense of the idea of community is something sometimes that needs to be recovered mm-hmm. or taken back mm-hmm. from those who use it in ways that can be detrimental, but also recover in that sense of care and recovery, of healing. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that dual sense of taking back, but also of healing.
I'm actually going to add more to it. To me, I think recovering community is something that people need to learn how to do in a world of so much isolation. This, to me, is a post-COVID question, where many people realized they were isolated and where virtual communities were not enough. In fact, they may not have actually been communities. What we needed were hybrid communities of some kind. But I think this longing, as human beings, we look for sociability, and that's different than hanging out in the pub, kind of the temporary community. I don't know, the whole notion of the individualism of, I'd say, advanced capitalism, that basically turns everyone into a transactional target We want your money, we want your this, we want your that. And then sells us pieces of things that should make us feel happier. If you have more money, you'll be happier, or if you wear this lipstick, you'll be really happy, or if you, all of that. So there are a lot of people who are just lost in those values. There's no place for them to be anchored. There's nowhere to go. I've been bringing up in my talks, I may bring this up tonight, but it's the existential question: what is my place and purpose in the world? What is my place and purpose in the world? And if you have no way of seeing that or imagining that, you're just out there on your own. You in many ways are like the alienated young men in the United States who have guns, who are doing mass shootings. All right, I've had to think about this from Lethal Intersections, my last book, which was on violence, and trying to come to grips with people who are just lone wolves. They're not in any communities, and they're a danger to themselves and to others. Or, sadly, some of our major social problems come from people like that, whether it is suicide or homicide, domestic violence. So community isn't just this warm, fuzzy place where you're just kind of hanging around with your friends and singing songs. I think it's quite fundamental to healthy societies. The issue is what kind. What kind of communities are we talking about? So recovering those that have been eroded, that you want them back, imagining new ones is another piece. The word is it's such a word of power. See where I'm going with this? Just kind of where we started.
Beautiful. Thank you for listening to this episode of Recovering Community. I'm Les Back, and I want to say a huge thank you to Patricia Hill Collins for her time, expertise, and for giving me a new perspective on the meaning and value of community. What a privilege it was to listen to her, and I hope you enjoyed being alongside us. You can find out more about the work of the university's Understanding Racism, Transforming University Cultures programme on the University of Glasgow's website, and I'll leave a link in the show notes. We're working on the next series of Recovering Community at the moment, and more episodes are on their way, from heritage and wellbeing walks in Govan to social dancing as a form of community. You can listen to all our previous episodes in the meantime, and it would make a huge difference if you subscribed and shared it. Thanks also to the staff in the School of Social and Political Sciences and the College of Social Sciences who helped with this project. Recovering Community is produced by Freya Hellier.